This video is going to explain what happened to me after I had a near-death experience. And if you haven't watched that video, it's called My Near-Death Experience, and I'll put a link to it in the comments. So after I had the car accident, I sold my house, I quit my job, I sold my vehicle and most of my belongings. I sold and gave away whatever was there. And at first I didn't go from having a full house of stuff down to having nothing. I did it in phases over a couple of months. I first got a storage locker and I put my skis and my favorite pieces of art and photo albums and that kind of stuff in the storage locker. And I used some of the savings to buy a camper van, and I lived for about 2 years on and off, mostly on in my camper van. When the weather was really cold, I went south to Mexico. And during that 2 years, I ended up giving away and selling what was remaining in the storage locker. And those 2 years were very, very much alone, very internal times for me, where I did a lot of reflecting. I wasn't a super duper meditator. I did meditate a little bit. A lot of the times was spent alone in nature, walking, hiking, sitting beside the fire, doing art. I was really, really blessed with having some of the savings from selling my house available to me to be able to just get away from society and do that. And also during that time, I had the opportunity to participate in quite a few ayahuasca ceremonies over a period of about 2 to 3 years. So during those 2 years, I would say it was pretty blissful. I felt very light and free from detaching from some of those things that I had stepped away from. I took that opportunity to visit lots of friends and basically make up for a lot of lost time. Lost time just sitting with myself, listening to my own voice, and just kind of contemplating my life and doing things that I'd always wanted to do. So yeah, those couple of years were very special. There was some pretty amazing moments for me during some of those ayahuasca ceremonies. And I feel that those ceremonies helped me to make some more sense of my near-death experience, as well as facilitating a healing process for a lot of childhood wounds and trauma that I'd experienced in life before the car accident. So specifically, and if anyone's worked with ayahuasca, they know that it's not an easy thing to do. There can be some really beautiful, some really beautiful parts of some ceremonies that are very precious. But ayahuasca is known as a plant medicine that can really stir up some very difficult physical and emotional and spiritual things in order to clear out those old attachments to patterns of thinking, old attachments to our pain. Sometimes we actually attach to pain in order to make some more space for beautiful things in our life. It's not an overnight process. You don't go to one ceremony and you're good to go. But for me, that 2 to 3 year process of sitting in ceremonies with some really awesome supportive facilitators that were very well trained helped me to move on. So in my near-death experience, I was transported to a very soft, dark, pillowy place that I spoke about in my video. But the interesting thing about being in these ayahuasca ceremonies was that I returned to that place but also moved a little further. I don't want to say further beyond, but yeah, further through into some other situations that ended up helping me to make a lot of sense of my car accident experience. And one of those experiences in ceremony went like this. I was in that dark place, that kind of outside of the body place, and there came a moment where I was actually very uncomfortable. It wasn't the exact same as my near-death experience place. It was kind of a little bit more quiet, a little bit more of the void. And I didn't feel that very strong presence that I was talking about in my video. This was more of a void-like place. And at first it was okay, but then my mind kicked in because I was more in my body, and my mind was like, whoa, like, what are you doing here? This is not right. And so fear started to build, which is something that does happen in ceremonies. And that fear really got going, and I found myself in actually a very challenging place, a very stuck place, where there was actually a lot of terror that was moving through my body. And I don't know how long that lasted, because there's a timeless feeling when you're in these ceremonies. But at some point in being super worked up and super uncomfortable, I remembered the surrender. I remembered the surrender that I used when I was headed into that car accident, where I kind of like just leaned back, relaxed, and trusted. So in that ceremony room, I did that again once I remembered to do that. I leaned back. I just gave up total control to higher power, and I relaxed. And after I did that, everything changed. All the dark realm that I was in completely dissolved, and I found myself in a place that was, once again, very, very familiar. But it was a place that I never remembered on earth. And what it was like there, when that darkness and that fear just fizzled away, was clear, white, sparkling air. And in the background, there was this tower that went up, 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 up. It was kind of like a spiral staircase around this tower. And this tower went up as far as the eye could see. I used my will and my intention to try and look up high, higher. And it was a never-ending tower. And on the railing that was going around the outside were people and animals and plants. And they were attached to this tower. You could see them all kind of distinguished, but like their body, the top of their body was like the part that you recognize, the face or the tree, and then the bottom half of them just kind of like melded into the tower. And the tower was shining and gold. It was so beautiful. It was like a living building. And when I focused in really hard, I noticed that I could think of someone or something, and I could locate them in the tower. I could even locate myself. So it was like the higher version of myself. And I found myself standing on this railing, and it was a more, I would say, like a more angelic, conscious version of myself. And I was wearing a long, flowing white dress that had crystals, and it was sparkling, and I was so at peace and so all-knowing and so happy. And beside me on this railing was actually a woman that I knew, from Earth. And her and I didn't always see eye to eye. And it was funny because I watched the me that was up there and the her that was up there standing side by side, and we were laughing, and we were the oldest of friends. It was like we had known each other for millions and millions of years. And there was a knowing as I was watching all this, a knowing that we had lived many lifetimes together. We had challenged each other in many ways. We had loved each other. We were old friends. And when I looked at me and her, we were laughing with each other as we looked down on Earth at the Earth versions of ourselves. Not particularly getting along, kind of rubbing each other the wrong way. And we were just laughing about how funny that was, how down there was like a dream, but up here was like real. And looking at this building and that version of me up there, it was like, oh, that's really who I am. That's the real me. That's the real everybody. Like that is the exalted version. And looking down from there on Earth, because I could kind of switch and be up there and looking down, I could see that down on Earth, but there was like pretty much total forgetfulness of this place, this very real place. Down there on Earth was a lot of, say, good stuff, a lot of difficult stuff, a lot of sleepwalking as far as really being aware and conscious of universal truths and how our actions and behavior affect other people and spirit realms, just a lot of unconsciousness. And another interesting thing that was happening up there was that these higher versions of ourselves were watching all the time, Earth, and even though they were outside of time, they could see the timelines of all humans, their human version of themselves. And if someone was getting really off track and really stuck in a cycle of behavior or way of being, up there we could manipulate reality to an extent to try and bring someone back on track. But the interesting thing was, we usually were doing that by challenging situations, like manipulating reality in order for an illness to take place in the human version of us, or manipulating reality in the form of a loss of some sort. And everything was coordinated, so it wasn't like I was up there just like making all these moves on the human version, on the conditions of the human version of me. Everyone in this building knew each other and were coordinating these changes of the Earth timelines as a group. And so I would say to someone else in the tower, hey, like the human version of me is very depressed and I need something. And so then that other person in the tower would say, okay, I'll guide the human version of me over and I'll invite you for dinner, and it'll cheer you up. Just even little things like that were going on. There was this, because we were outside of time, we could all be doing this and time was like, moving super slowly below us. Another cool thing about the version of us up there was that we had these very beautiful, like I mentioned, like shining, glowing garments, but there was more to it. They were holographic, and these garments had like shining symbols on them, and our skin, it wasn't skin, but the surface of our body had shining symbols, kind of like tattoos, but glowing, different gold, and there was some really beautiful light turquoise glowing symbols on people. And these tattoo symbols that were actually like part of us, they communicated to others different experience that we had gained, different things that we had achieved in our earth lives, and they were like badges of honor. And we recognized each other not so much by the look of our face, but by the different energies that we carried and the experiences we had. So we were each giving off something extremely unique and special. And so, again, this whole situation was very much outside of time. But as I watched me and this woman that was standing beside me on the tower, just having a real giggle about the stubborn, egoic earth versions of ourselves, in the ceremony, I grabbed my pillow and I just started giggling into the pillow because I also thought it was so funny. So I wanted to share that ceremony experience because I felt as though it was kind of a continuation of my near-death experience, because I kind of went to the same place, but I kept going. And there were other times in ceremonies where I felt like I was picking up on threads from what happened in my near-death experience and been given more information to come back with, which is partly why I kept going to those ceremonies. I felt very guided to do that. There was another time, and it's very hard for me to remember now, and it was actually pretty hard for me to remember the morning after the ceremony. But what I could recall and what I wrote down was being in this room. It was like a glowing dome. And in that room, there were angels and just seemed like very wise people that I had known from other lives, that I knew from in between lives. And when I was in this glowing dome, there were symbols and writing on the wall that I didn't understand, but they were kind of glowing the same way as those tattoos were glowing. And I met with a man, and he had a feeling of being very loving, very wise, and very ancient. And he was telling me, it was like I traveled back in time to my near-death experience and started to remember things that had happened while I was out of body in my near-death experience. But after the near-death experience, I didn't remember. So I'm in this ceremony and I'm kind of picking up from where I left off with this man in this glowing dome. And he said to me, "You're going to go back to Earth. It's definitely not your time, but things are going to speed up. Things are going to speed up a lot for you, and you're going to participate in some ayahuasca ceremonies. And those ceremonies and the integration work that you're going to do with them are going to help you move past the car accident and move you into the next phase of your life. They're going to be gifts to you because you're going to be able to return to this place." And so those experiences, among others, really helped me to understand and integrate my car accident experience. After those 2 or 3 years when I was in my van, that were mostly quite blissful and relaxing and creative times for me, I ended up heading into a real dark night of the soul. And if you've experienced a dark night of the soul, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. It's different than a clinical depression, although there are parallels. With the clinical depression, there's a real flatness. For many people, there's a lot of just like either loss of appetite or overeating, a feeling of guilt and laziness, being, maybe suicidal, self-harm, just very, very clinical depression. With the dark night of the soul, there can be those things, but there's actually a very distinguished thing where you feel a huge loss of any presence of spirit, to the point where you didn't realize, like when you're in the dark night of the soul, you didn't realize just how connected you actually are to the presence of spirit in your day-to-day life until you get over here and it's gone. And there's a real spiritual disconnection and a real questioning of any good thing that's ever happened, real questioning of any spiritual experience that's ever happened. Like, you wonder if it even really happened, or if it was real, or if you're just making it up in your head. And if you're a spiritual person that has a connection to, God or higher power, it's extremely difficult to find it no matter what you do. You can fast, you can sing, you can pray, you can do anything you want for all day and all night, but you're not going to be able to make that connection when you're in the dark night of the soul, if it's a true dark night of the soul. There can be, for some people, some real existential angst, and this can go on for months, and it can go on for years. And for me, this went on for about 2 years. And what showed up was pretty much all of the things that I hadn't dealt with in my life, all kinds of issues that had happened over the years that I thought happened and then left and that was it. They just came back one by one. Things that I didn't realize I had attachments to. And some people call this a purging of all that no longer is in alignment as you're moving along your spiritual path. Certain patterns of behavior, certain ways of even seeing the world and interacting with other people are not a good fit for where you're going. And they get taken away, sometimes very suddenly and violently, by your environment or by things that happen in the world. For me, I noticed there was a lot of physical trouble that also came with it. I started getting, 12 to 14 days of extreme menstrual pain every month. And I mean extreme menstrual pain. It felt like someone was just tearing up my insides. There was, during those 12 to 14 days a month, massive bloating to the point where I couldn't even practice like a gentle restorative yoga. It was all I could do was lie in bed. I got extremely constipated. It wouldn't matter how much water I drank, how much fiber I ate. Enemas, it didn't matter. Everything was just stuck. And I couldn't tolerate most foods, even very bland foods. I also had a series of just very difficult, spontaneous interactions in my day-to-day life where I would be just minding my own business. My rent was paid. I was keeping my own, my own space. And I would have a crazy landlord that would just get drunk and start harassing me. So I'd have to get up and move. And all kinds of other just very strange things that didn't normally happen to me. It was like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time constantly. And I started to really question my sanity, because it was like no matter where I went, things just weren't working out. And it was really hard to trust in myself. And I started to have a revisiting of an eating disorder. I suffered from an eating disorder for about 10 years when I was in my teen years. It was a compulsive overeating disorder where I would just eat constantly. I would hide food, was very ashamed of this. I would work out at the gym for like 2 hours a day to try and negate all this food I ate. And I would eat so much food that I would just like pass out from being so tired from it. This went on for like 10 years of my teen years. And it kind of went away in my early 20s. And suddenly I'm in this dark night of the soul, and those symptoms are back. Like I would just, eat one piece of bread, and I had this crazy compulsion, like to keep eating bread. And I was like, I would just, eat another piece of bread and put it back in the kitchen and go upstairs. And I'm just obsessively thinking about going back downstairs to eat more bread for the rest of the night. Like it was just like crazy mind games, addiction. And I thought that eating disorder was gone forever, and I really struggled with it a lot during those 2 years. I would sometimes wake up from sleeping and be having a dream about something that happened a long, long time ago. Or I would even jump back into a dream that I had had in childhood. So imagine you had a dream in childhood, you forgot about the dream, and now you're in your late 30s and you're stuck back in the identical nightmare, like you picked up where you left off. And I would wake up from those dreams and I would feel really nauseous. I would dry heave, burp. It was like the energy was leaving my body from these different things. I started to spontaneously remember tons and tons of different things that had happened in my life that I totally forgot it ever happened. And suddenly I was right back in them. Sometimes it was something that I felt very sad and ashamed and guilty about. Like I remember I was taking care of this young woman in a group home when I was in my early 20s. She was really challenging to take care of. She was always pressing my buttons and she was violent. And I remember being pretty rude to her on a couple of occasions. And during this dark night of the soul, I was having vivid memories of the way that I was speaking to her. But in my memory, I was feeling how I made her feel. And I just felt terrible. I just felt like I wanted to go hide under a rock. And other things happened that were, things that my subconscious recorded and I didn't even know. And now I was reliving them as they were being cleared and cleaned out of me. One of those things was an operation. I was having my tonsils removed when I was like 3 or 4. I didn't have much of a memory of it. And suddenly I'm reliving this event. I was kind of in a bit of a dream state, like between when you fall asleep and between when you're awake and when you fall asleep. I suddenly was back in the hospital for this surgery, and I'm like 3 years old, and I can smell the disinfectant. I can see kind of like the pale turquoise walls of the hospital. I can like see the scratchy hospital blanket, and I'm being wheeled into an operating room, and the doctor puts this mask on my face for anesthesia. And in real life, I just fell asleep, had the operation, and woke up with a sore throat. But as I'm reliving this event, they put the mask on me, but there's a part of me that's still watching and still alert. And I can hear the doctors talking and they're making a joke, and someone says, okay, she's out. And then someone else says, okay, hand me it was like the name of the tool. And then there's like and I felt like a vibration in my throat. And then I heard someone say cauterize. And there was like a noise. And then they're like, done. It was like all over in like minutes. And then I got wheeled out to the recovery room. And then some time passed. And then I woke up out of the anesthesia. And my parents weren't around. They didn't know that I was awake yet. They're probably somewhere in the hospital. And how I felt when I woke up was so alone. It felt like something was missing from my throat. But worse than any of that was I was totally alone, 3 or 4 years old, totally alone in a weird place with some anesthesia going on, but my parents were nowhere. These little events that happen to us that are traumatic as children, but they're really kind of non-events. I realized this stuff, everything gets recorded in our subconscious in every detail, and it can be affecting us from the background, and we don't even know. And it really caused me to do a lot of processing around being uncomfortable while alone, and how that energy has always been in me since that age of being a little hypervigilant about preventing aloneness. And so these are the ways that, as challenging as the dark night of the soul was, I was getting a life review, but on this side, on the human side, where you hear a lot of people get a life review on the other side, this content just like, it was just like every day more memories would come back. And then there was a huge test for me that came along. So I got COVID. I was very sick for 2 months. Very sick for 2 months. and I spent a lot of time just kind of sleeping in and out of consciousness, meditating. It really slowed me down. I wasn't quite out of the dark night of the soul. I was kind of moving out of it a little bit, but I was still pretty down. And I ended up meeting a man that became a romantic partner, and we decided to go do some traveling together and volunteering at a few different places. So we spent about 4 months traveling, volunteering. We had a ton in common. We created music together. We made art. We had a just really good connection. And I discovered sometime, I guess we were about 5 months into our relationship, I discovered that he was talking to some other girl online, and there was a connection there. And so I confronted him about it and asked him about that. And he denied it and this kind of thing. And so the next day I said that I needed to go. I needed at least some space, but in my mind I was like, I don't think this is the right fit for me. And we were staying in a hotel, and he locked me in the hotel room. I didn't realize it happened. He left with the key, and he locked the door behind him, and he went on a walk. And when he came back, he was very, very drunk, and he started getting very aggressive with me, telling me that I wasn't leaving and this kind of thing. And then he started punching me in the head. He headbutted me a bunch of times. He threatened to bite my nose off. He pushed me over, and he was whipping me with an extension cord. And we were in this room for about 6 hours, and he's yelling all these really horrible things at me. And the windows, they had security bars on them, so I couldn't get out any windows, and it was a really, really, really horrible situation. And I think part of it was so horrible was that I didn't know how long I was getting locked in there. Like I had no escape route, and I was also, like not as strong as him. It was very terrifying. And yet I feel like it was the hugest test of my near-death experience, because when he was right in my face and he had like his fingers on my eyes like this, he said he was going to poke my eyes out. And I remember just the whole time, no matter what was going on, like I did try and resist him and push him away. But I kept very outwardly calm. My heart was racing, but I kept myself very, very calm as far as how my body was. And I remember saying to him, there's nothing it doesn't matter what you do. You can kill me if you want, but I'm a spirit, and I'm just going to come back here again. And I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not afraid of dying. And the whole time that I was in that room going through this, I really had a strong sense of presence, the same presence that I got very much connected with in my near-death experience, that stayed with me after and was like very pronounced in those first couple of years when I was living in my van, and that was very difficult to connect with when I was in the dark night of the soul. But because of how strong it had been before the dark night of the soul, I retained a knowing, a very, very solid knowing and trusting that even though I couldn't feel that presence because my vibration was so low in the dark night of the soul, I realized it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means I'm down here and I can't feel it. I've dropped into this very low place, but it's still here. I'm just not with the antenna at the moment to to feel that presence. So it actually didn't matter that I couldn't feel it because of the knowing. So when I'm locked in this hotel room and all this is going down, at the same time, I realized it doesn't matter. The presence is here. The presence is both inside me and around me. So whatever this guy does, even if I do die, I am with the presence. There has been a partial merge of me and it. And meeting it in the car accident, connecting with it in the ceremonies, completely prepared me to move through this terrible ordeal with grace. He ended up crashing, falling asleep, passing out. He was so drunk, and I was able to get the key out of his hand. His hand was kind of like open when he fell asleep. I left myself out. And I spent the next 6 months next 6 months totally alone. I moved, well, not totally, but I moved into a house that I shared with another woman, but she didn't even speak English. So, there was very little talk. And other than, doing meetings for work and talking to a counselor, I was in complete isolation. And during these 6 months, it was probably my rock bottom. And from that rock bottom and that, kind of continued dark night of the soul is where I started to rebuild my life. All I did was my online job and periods of fasting, yin yoga, my counseling appointments, and walking the dog and sitting in the garden, preparing really healthy food for myself and praying without any distraction, without any social. I think I went out for dinner once in 6 months. And when I think about those 6 months now, they're the most precious 6 months. It was just me and the presence. And it wasn't magical or blissful or euphoric. I was experiencing a lot of post-trauma symptoms. I would wake up with a racing heart. My vibration was down here. My digestive system, kind of like from here down to the bottom of my stomach, was constantly just frozen. It was almost like all the time. I lost my appetite. It was like I was just a rock. The constipation was back. It was such a difficult 6 months. It helped me to understand a little bit about what PTSD sufferers have going on. It forced me to get really curious about different modalities that would support recovery from that. It inspired me to eventually, after that 6 months passed and I got a little bit more balanced, to start studying to become a certified trauma coach. And my empathy went up a lot. It went up a lot. After the 6 months, I would say I started to reemerge from the dark night of the soul. And I am so thankful that it happened, because that dark night of the soul was a completely powerful purging, cleaning, purification of all this old stuff. It was like living side by side with like all of these energies and memories of the past that were not empowering. It was like being purified of all these prior impulses, all these prior ways of responding to situations, and realizing when and how they weren't perfected. They weren't ways that I wanted to continue with going forward. And after that 6 months, it was a real beginning that person that I was before, really a lot of that person was gone and started to get replaced with a different person, with a new person. If you're someone who's in the dark night of the soul, or any version of it, it's important to remember that the sun eventually comes up. There's no stopping the sun. The dark night of the soul doesn't go on forever, and it can't compete with the rising of the sun. If you're in it, focus on what you need to see, even if it's really uncomfortable truths about yourself or how you've been showing up in the world. And try and see those things without any shame, just with understanding. Know that if you're standing in the fire, It's not going to burn the real you. It's only going to burn off things, people, ways of thinking, attachments that are not going to serve you in your forward movement. The fire's not there to hurt you. The fire wasn't there to hurt me. It's there to wake us up to things that no longer fit. That dark night of the soul became my guide. And even though many times during it, I didn't sense presence in a super strong way, there was an unshakable knowing that it was there. It was just me that was down here, so I couldn't connect with it in the same way. But it didn't mean that it wasn't there. It just meant my senses of it were temporarily on hold. Yeah, that dark night of the soul, really, without it coming through and starting to clean off some of these things, I wouldn't have been able to move forward in those areas. So those are some of the things that happened after my car accident. It was a lot of up, it was a lot of down, and now what's changed since then for me, as far as my perception of suffering, my perception of pain, is that I'm okay to sit with it. It's not always comfortable. I don't always do it perfectly. But I've learned that if I can sit with whatever comes, a racing heart, regret, shame, embarrassment, just like general resistance around something that's going on in my life or something that's showed up. If I can sit with it and be like, okay, it's here. It feels absolutely horrifying. It's temporary. And if I can relax into this moment while it's here, it's going to move through faster. It's going to move through with more ease. And once it moves through, I'm going to have some more wisdom around that thing. It's here to teach me something while it moves through. Sometimes our greatest teachers are actually the most terrible feelings and situations that we ever encounter and have the most dramatic impact going forward. So my relationship to pain and suffering has changed quite a bit, because when pain and suffering does show up, there's a knowing inside of me that once it's passed through, I'm going to be left with some kind of a gift or a blessing as a result of it. The dark night of the soul is a real test. You can have the opportunity to really develop nerves of steel if you can accept the feelings that pass through. If you can be patient and remind yourself everything is temporary, it can be one of the biggest blessings and transformative things of your life. But if you're in it, there's not a lot that you can do. Try not to resist it too much. And I think the best thing that I would do every day was just remind myself that it was temporary. Over and over, I would remind myself that it was temporary. Yeah, if you're in it. If you're in it right now, it's temporary. Presence is with you, but you might be down here temporarily, so you can't sense and feel presence. Presence is not judging you. God is not judging you. God is patiently watching you realize things you need to realize. Patiently watching you see what needs to be seen. And is eagerly awaiting your rise when the timing is right and when you've experienced what needed to happen down here in the valley. Thanks. Thanks for listening to my after near-death experience integration so far.